Now, as I said before, fake it until you make it. Or as is the case in professional wrestling, faking it is making it. Now, what's always intrigued me is that while most people seem to know that professional wrestling is fake, how few people really seem to know just how the magic gets done. Now, I've previously done a video on this exact same subject before, but last time I focused on more modern methods. So this time, I figure we adopt more of an old school mentality. And that's going to be the subject of this episode, because today, Dave knows 3 more ways to fake a pro wrestling match. Alright, now before we get started, there are a couple of things we need to get out of the way. Number 1, yet again, do not try this at home. This information is purely for educational purposes and nothing more. Leave pro wrestling to professionals. Number 2, pro wrestling is still an industry full of mostly secrets. They don't really want you to know how the magic gets done. So while yes, all these processes are valid and this information comes from fairly reliable sources, it's still worth noting that they're not the only methods to put on a pro wrestling match. After all, this is my second video on the subject. And finally, even though this episode is focusing on more of an old school mentality, that doesn't mean that some of these practices aren't still being used today. So with that being said, let's get things started. First method, the heels take the lead. Now previously I mentioned how in the WWE today, many matches comprise of the older, more experienced talent leading the way and calling the shots for the up and coming rookie. Now back in the day, they did something very similar, but instead of the more experienced wrestler, it was actually always the heel. That's right, the bad guy. The kayfabe character actually had more control in the real life match. Now the key to both of these methods is that if you're not going to plan out the match 100% in advance, well then someone needs to be taking the charge and figuring out what's the next best course of action to do until the finish. So I know it's pretty far out that the kayfabe character of the bad guy would call the shots. But why is this? Well, it isn't arbitrary. This old school tradition actually came about because the heel is the one that used to do most of the work. Back in the day when bad guys were bad guys and good guys were good guys, a bad guy had a much harder role than the hero. When the bad guy has to be dominant, he needs to look really menacing and threatening. That way, when the good guy overpowers him, it seems like a greater accomplishment. But when the bad guy's getting worked over, he's got to growl in pain and really make it satisfying for the audience that he's finally suffering. Back in the day, the heel was the one who really required the most wrestling psychology, and as a result, they were the ones that were most entrusted to really lead the match. After all, they were the ones who really knew how to work the crowd and knew how to feed off of what the audience is looking for, and they were best suited to know when a match has gone stale. And keep in mind, a lot of pro wrestling is about keeping your partner safe, and the person who's getting worked over the most is the one that usually has the most control. So when it comes to the bad guys doing the most work and getting put through the paces even harder, it makes perfect sense why the heels should be the ones calling the shots. Next up, it's all about booking. Now continuing on this line of thinking, back when bad guys were bad guys and good guys were good guys, believe it or not, a lot of times in order to protect kayfabe, they were actually kept in separate dressing rooms. That's right, the heels would be in one locker room and the faces would be in another. Now, what would happen is the head booker would walk into both dressing rooms and give out the instructions. Now this is the part where wrestling shorthand really comes into play. For example, he would tell wrestlers things like, hey, do a double crisscross into a lariat, then go into that spot you did last week. I really like that. Hold off for a second, get a long two, and then go into the finish right into Broadway. Okay? Good job. Got it? Next match. And then just do that for everyone in the locker room. Quick sequences and exchanges all had little names, and it was just a matter of shuffling around the combination thereof for the finish of each match. And while the wrestlers were free to improvise and show off their skills up until that point, the finish was always going to be protected, and a lot of times was actually the biggest amount of change you were getting in the entire match. Now yes, this does give the booker an awfully large amount of control, but if the booker's really good, that's not a problem, because good bookers really know just how to put on a show. And finally, plotting it all out. Now this is a misconception that a lot of non-wrestling fans have, but it's not completely unfounded. Now a lot of non-wrestling fans out there assume that every single aspect of a pro wrestling match is completely plotted out start to finish. And while that's mostly not the way it happens, there are a few cases in which that's actually true. Take the Macho Man Randy Savage. He was notorious for wanting to plot out every single move of a match in advance. Now this is allegedly so much so that he went as far to try and fax Ricky the Dragon Steamboat all the moves of their match in advance before their legendary match at WrestleMania 3. Now, Ricky the Dragon Steamboat was much more of an impromptu kind of guy, so this apparently drove him crazy. And while there is some criticism to this method, let's not forget, Macho definitely showed how much it worked. because him and Ricky definitely knew how to put on art. Now, as this translates to the modern era, a lot of wrestlers do plot things out in advance, but definitely not to this extent. Now, back in the day, wrestlers used to show up about an hour before curtain. Now they show up hours in advance and make sure they work out a lot of their matches before the curtain ever goes up. However, they still leave a lot of leeway for some improv. And so in a lot of ways, some wrestlers take the very best of Ricky and Macho's mentalities and combine them together. And I guess that's undeniable, seeing the fact that that match at WrestleMania 3 was truly great. Well, there you go, 3 more methods to fake a pro wrestling match. But what do you think? Let me know in the comments, and don't forget to give this video a big thumbs up. Thank you so much for watching, and this has been Dave Knows.